The precise instant Kale's fingers closed around Caspian Thorne's sleeve, the underground war room fell silent with the abruptness of a severed artery. The child's hand shook against charcoal wool tailored in Milan, small enough that his entire grip barely spanned the fabric's width. Yet the contact carried desperation that paralyzed 19 armed men in various stages of reaching for weapons they understood they couldn't draw. Caspian's companion, a municipal judge negotiating immunity for 3 pending investigations, froze mid-gesture with his pen hovering above documents, complexion blanching as he calculated how proximity to a child interrupting the city's most untouchable man might compromise his carefully constructed survival strategy. The conference table dominated the converted vault with tactical positioning that provided clear sight lines to both reinforced entrances and the emergency tunnel concealed behind false paneling. The room's interior communicated power through calculated restraint rather than ostentatious display. Its steel-reinforced concrete walls held surveillance monitors showing real-time feeds from 17 locations across the city where Thorne's interests operated. Recessed lighting cast cold illumination across the marble surface polished to mirror brightness, while the ventilation system maintained perfect temperature control that never varied beyond precisely 67 degrees, and the space smelled faintly of gun oil and aged leather from chairs imported from a Turin workshop that catered exclusively to men who valued discretion over recognition. Kale stood wearing a jacket patched at the shoulders with material that didn't match the original gray canvas. His cargo pants bore stains that spoke of desperate flight rather than careless play. His canvas shoes tracked moisture across polished concrete from December rain that had transformed gutters into torrents of freezing runoff, and his dark hair plastered to his skull in patterns suggesting he'd been running through downpour for blocks without stopping. 4 different security personnel had attempted to intercept the child before he breached the inner chamber, but Kale had evaded them with determination that overrode every survival instinct a 10-year-old should possess. Silas Grave now stood 20 feet distant with his hand pressed against the concealed holster beneath his jacket, visibly calculating whether his decade of service would survive this catastrophic security breach or if he should begin preparing contingency plans for immediate disappearance. Caspian's eyes, gray enough to resemble winter storms trapped in human form, fixed on the child with attention that had extracted confessions from decorated soldiers just to escape the weight of that scrutiny. His posture remained deliberately relaxed against leather upholstery custom-fitted to his exact specifications. But everyone who understood him recognized the stillness that preceded decisions with permanent consequences and irreversible endings. The words erupted from Kale's mouth in a cascade that suggested he'd been rehearsing them during his entire desperate journey to reach this moment. His voice carried clearly in the oppressive silence that had consumed the war room. "Your men destroyed my family," he said. The accusation delivered with childhood directness that didn't comprehend diplomatic evasion or strategic omission of uncomfortable truths. At surrounding positions, Thorne's captains resumed their document review with forced normalcy that deceived no one. Men suddenly discovering their financial reports and territorial maps absolutely fascinating while their peripheral awareness remained locked on the unfolding confrontation. 2 lieutenants near the weapons locker exchanged glances weighted with concern that would have seemed protective if their eyes hadn't been calculating career implications of witnessing whatever transpired next. Caspian's enforcer stationed near the tunnel access moved his hand away from the blade concealed at his spine, recognizing that his employer's absence of immediate response meant violence was postponed indefinitely. The man had served Caspian for 13 years and could interpret his moods the way sailors read approaching weather, predicting storms before the first lightning split the sky. The judge across from Caspian carefully placed his fountain pen on the contract with precision that suggested he was concentrating intensely on avoiding sudden movements that might redirect attention to his presence. His respiration had grown shallow enough that his chest barely moved and perspiration gathered at his temples despite the vault's perfectly maintained climate control. Kale's grip on the sleeve hadn't weakened despite the pressure of 24 stairs boring into his thin frame. His knuckles bone-white with exertion, and his jaw clenched with resolve that made him appear years beyond his actual age. The child wavered slightly, exhaustion evident in the shadows carved beneath his eyes, and the way he continuously shifted his weight from foot to foot, as if remaining upright demanded more energy than he possessed. Caspian reached for the crystal tumbler at his right hand with movements so measured they appeared almost inhuman, raising it to his lips for a sip that purchased him 4 seconds to process incoming data. His mind was already cross-referencing and analyzing. His organization functioned under ironclad protocols that rendered unauthorized operations not merely prohibited, but inconceivable, which meant this child was either fabricating accusations or something had deteriorated catastrophically within the command structure. The ventilation system's white noise suddenly seemed amplified in the frozen tableau. The mechanical hum and filtered air creating strange contrast to the suspended moment in the war room. A junior associate carrying encrypted hard drives stood motionless near the server bank. Unable to complete his assignment without passing the conference table where procedures he didn't understand were being violated. Caspian set his tumbler down with the same deliberate control he applied to every action. The crystal base meeting marble without producing audible contact. His focus remained absolute on the child whose fingers still gripped his sleeve. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no more volume than necessary to reach Kale's ears while somehow filling the entire vault with presence that made grown men forget to breathe. "Your name," Caspian said. "Welcome back, my loves. Before we continue, please tap the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and share this story with someone who needs it. Also, comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the algorithm know you want more content like this. Alright, let's dive in." The 2 words containing neither threat nor reassurance, but simple demand for information that would determine every subsequent action. The question bypassed all obvious responses he might have given, ignored the security breach and protocol violation, and went directly to the foundation of whatever circumstances had delivered a 10-year-old into his domain. Kale's throat contracted as he swallowed hard, his eyes flickering briefly toward the exits he'd memorized on entry with the automatic spatial awareness children developed in dangerous territories. But his hand didn't release its grip on expensive fabric, and his voice remained steady when he answered with first name only, the single word carrying weight of identity claimed rather than granted. Silas received some signal imperceptible to everyone else present, extracting his encrypted phone with movements that attempted casualness but achieved only visible tension. He typed rapidly with fingers that had broken more ribs than sent messages, his expression neutral, while his attention tracked every individual who might represent threat to the unfolding situation nobody had anticipated or prepared for. Caspian's focus shifted to the sleeve Kale still gripped, studying the small hand with its dirt-embedded fingernails and abraded knuckles that testified to recent collision with something substantially harder than flesh. The child had been in physical confrontation before arriving here, had possibly fought someone or something to reach this location, and the calculation of what species of desperation drove that level of determination was already restructuring Caspian's evening priorities into something entirely divergent from immunity negotiations. The judge seized the moment of Caspian's divided attention to rise with movements that aspired toward dignity but achieved only transparent escape, mumbling something about morning hearings and family commitments, while his eyes pleaded for permission to vanish. Caspian dismissed him with a gesture so minimal it barely qualified as acknowledgement. His concentration already returned to Kale before the man completed 3 steps toward the exit. "They came to our building yesterday," Kale said, the words emerging in deliberate sequence as if he'd been organizing them mentally throughout his journey to this confrontation. The child's free hand gestured vaguely toward what might have been southeast, indicating distance he traversed on foot through neighborhoods that grew progressively more hazardous as they approached this fortified location. "They wore your mark. They hurt my mother when she couldn't pay. They said you sent them. They said everyone has to pay what they owe to Caspian Thorne, or you take something more valuable than money." The statement hung in recycled air like cordite after gunfire. Caspian's expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes crystallized into the kind of focus that had built his empire from street-level enforcement into citywide dominion. His mind was already mapping personnel deployments, identifying which crews operated in southeastern sectors, and calculating which of his captains might have authorized operations that violated codes he'd established when he'd first seized control of the underworld's infrastructure. Kale's hand finally released the sleeve, but he didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket with movements careful enough to avoid triggering defensive responses from watching men, and extracted a torn piece of fabric. The cloth bore Caspian's insignia embroidered in silver thread that caught the overhead lighting, and the material was stained with something dark that might have been mud but probably wasn't. My mother said I shouldn't come here, Cale continued, his voice beginning to fracture around the edges as exhaustion and fear finally penetrated the adrenaline that had carried him this far. She said men like you don't help people like us. She said I'd probably disappear and she'd never know what happened. But they're coming back tomorrow. And she doesn't have the money. And I don't know what else they'll take. The child's eyes held Caspian's with directness that adults who'd spent decades navigating the criminal underworld had learned to avoid. And in that unguarded stare, Caspian saw something that made his carefully constructed world fracture along fault lines he'd believed were sealed permanently. He saw Isolde Vane's eyes. The same unusual shade caught between gray and green. The same determination that refused to yield even when yielding meant survival. The same accusation that demanded he remember the man he'd been before power had consumed everything softer than ambition. Caspian stood with fluid economy that suggested coiled violence barely restrained, and every man in the vault tensed in unconscious response to the shift in his posture. He moved around the conference table toward Cale with strides that covered distance without appearing hurried, and when he reached the child, he knelt on one knee so their eyes met at equal height. The gesture shocked his assembled captains more than the security breach had. Nobody could recall seeing Caspian Thorne kneel before anyone for any reason since he'd taken control of the organization. The men who hurt your mother, Caspian said, his voice carrying different quality now, something colder than the calculated neutrality he'd maintained moments before. Did you recognize any of them? Did they give you names? Did they say anything else about who sent them or what they wanted? Cale nodded, reaching into his other pocket to produce a crumpled photograph taken on someone's phone and printed on cheap paper. The image showed 3 men outside a deteriorating apartment building. 2 of them wore jackets bearing Thorne's crest. The third held a woman's arm twisted behind her back while she tried to shield a child behind her body with her free hand. Caspian took the photograph with fingers that didn't tremble despite the recognition that detonated in his chest like a shaped charge. The woman in the image was older, thinner, marked by years that hadn't been kind. But he would have known Isolde's face in any condition, across any distance, after any span of years. And the realization that his organization, his people, operating under his authority and using his name, had been terrorizing the one woman he'd never been able to completely excise from memory transformed something fundamental in the architecture of his carefully constructed emotional isolation. Silas, Caspian said, not looking away from the photograph. His voice had gone quiet in the way that made experienced criminals understand that someone was about to die slowly. Find out who authorized operations in the southeast sectors. Find out who these men report to. Find out who thought they had permission to target civilians in protected territories. And do it in the next 30 minutes, or start updating your resume, because if you're part of this, I'll bury you so deep they'll need archaeological equipment to find the remains. He stood, still holding the photograph, and looked down at Cale with expression that might have been the first genuinely human thing to cross his face in years. You did the right thing coming here, he said. And you're correct that men like me don't usually help people like you. But your mother was wrong about one thing. You're not going to disappear. You're going to take me to your building right now, and I'm going to make absolutely certain that nobody ever touches your family again. Do you understand? Cale nodded, exhaustion and relief and residual terror fighting for control of his expression. Caspian placed one hand on the child's shoulder with surprising gentleness for fingers that had killed more men than most soldiers, and guided him toward the exit while issuing rapid orders to his captains that sent half the room into immediate mobilization. The untouchable Mafia boss was about to become very touchable indeed. But not in any way his enemies or his own people were prepared to handle. Because Caspian Thorne had just been reminded that some parts of his past refused to stay buried. And when the past came calling with a child's bruised face and a woman's photo, the present was about to become extremely violent for anyone who'd made the catastrophic mistake of thinking his name could be used as weapon against the innocent. The war room emptied rapidly as men scattered to execute orders, leaving only Caspian, Cale, and Silas standing in the vault's cold illumination. And for the first time in 12 years, Caspian felt something other than the calculated numbness that had defined his existence since the night he'd chosen empire over love. He felt rage. Pure, focused, and absolutely certain in its direction. Someone was going to answer for this. Multiple someones. And by the time he finished extracting those answers, everyone in his organization would understand exactly what happened to people who mistook his ruthlessness for permission to prey on the vulnerable. The reckoning was coming. And Caspian Thorne always collected his debts in full. Caspian spread the evidence across the marble surface with movements that belonged in a surgical theater rather than a criminal war room. The photographs formed a constellation of accusations, each image more damning than the last. Cale had documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that adults required proof before they believed children. 3 men outside the apartment building at dawn. The same men returning at dusk. Close-ups of their jacket insignias captured with a phone camera held in shaking hands. Timestamps written in careful block letters across the bottom of each printed sheet, the ink slightly smeared where small fingers had gripped paper still wet from a drugstore printer. The torn fabric insignia lay centered among the photographs like evidence in a murder trial. Caspian lifted it between thumb and forefinger, studying the silver embroidery that marked it as authentic rather than counterfeit. The thread pattern matched specifications he'd personally approved 8 years ago when he'd standardized his organization's identification protocols. Someone had bled on this cloth recently enough that the stain hadn't completely dried. The metallic scent still clung faintly to the material. Cale had also brought witness statements, though calling them that felt almost absurd given their source. Lined notebook paper covered in a child's handwriting, each entry dated and timed. Tuesday 6:30 p.m., 3 men knocked on apartment 4C. Mrs. Chin gave them money. They said it wasn't enough. They broke her window. Wednesday 4:15 p.m., same men came back. Took Mr. Rodriguez's television. He cried after they left. Thursday 7 p.m., they came to our door. Mama told me to hide in the closet. I heard her scream. The entries continued for 2 weeks, forming a narrative of systematic terrorization that made something cold and ancient shift in Caspian's chest. He'd built his empire on violence, certainly, but structured violence that followed rules older than the city itself. You didn't prey on civilians who'd never entered the game. You didn't terrorize neighborhoods under protection. You didn't extract tribute from people who had nothing to give except their dignity and their blood. These protocols weren't morality, they were the foundation that separated organized crime from random chaos. Silas returned within 20 minutes, his expression carrying information before his mouth opened. Southeast Sector falls under Varick's operational authority. Has for 18 months since the territorial restructuring. These particular streets should be off-limits under the South Side Accord. Civilian protection in exchange for information flow. Varick knows the protocols. Caspian's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the only visible reaction to confirmation of what he'd already begun to suspect. Varick had been with the organization for 6 years, rising through ranks with combination of competence and calculated brutality that Caspian had mistaken for loyalty. The realization that his second-in-command had been conducting unauthorized operations transformed organizational betrayal into something more personally offensive. He'd trusted Varick with significant autonomy. That trust had apparently been weaponized against the vulnerable. Council meeting is over, Caspian announced, his voice carrying through the vault without requiring volume. Everyone out except Silas. We'll reconvene when I've cleaned my house. The captains filed toward the exit with expressions carefully neutral, though several exchanged glances weighted with speculation. They'd witnessed something unprecedented tonight. Their untouchable boss kneeling before a child. Rage barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. A purge was coming, and everyone would be calculating their proximity to Varick's operations and whether their survival required proactive distance or demonstrated loyalty. Kale moved toward the exit with the others, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline now that his mission was complete. He'd done what he came to do. Delivered his accusation to the only person with authority to stop the nightmare consuming his mother. Whether that person chose to act remained uncertain, but the weight of that decision no longer rested on 10-year-old shoulders. "Wait," Caspian said, the single word stopping Kale mid-step. The child turned, wariness returning to his features, survival instinct screaming that lingering in the predator's den invited consequences he might not survive. Caspian closed the distance between them with strides that covered space without menace, though Kale's body tensed regardless. Caspian's attention had snagged on something glinting at Kale's throat. A silver chain disappeared beneath the collar of his worn jacket, and at the end of that chain hung a locket just visible when the boy moved. The piece was distinctive enough to be unmistakable. Art Nouveau design, silver worked into flowing patterns that resembled water, with a tiny sapphire embedded in the clasp. He'd commissioned that locket from a jeweler in the old quarter 12 years ago, spending money he couldn't afford on something beautiful for someone he'd loved desperately and left completely. "That necklace," Caspian said, his voice carrying different quality now, something raw breaking through the controlled surface. "Where did you get it?" Kale's hand moved protectively to his chest, fingers closing around the locket with defensive instinct that suggested this object held value beyond monetary worth. "It's my mom's. She let me wear it tonight for protection. Said it used to belong to someone important who gave it to her a long time ago." The child's eyes narrowed slightly, intelligence working behind exhaustion. "She said the man who gave it to her promised he'd come back. But he never did." The words hit Caspian with more force than any physical blow he'd absorbed in his violent ascent to power. That locket around Kale's neck meant Isolde had kept it through 12 years of whatever hardship had marked her face in those photographs. Kept it despite him never returning, never checking if she'd survived the life he'd abandoned her to, never wondering if his choice to pursue power over love had left consequences beyond his own carefully buried regret. Caspian reached out slowly, carefully, and lifted the locket from where it rested against Kale's chest. The boy flinched but didn't pull away, watching with confused wariness as Caspian opened the clasp with fingers that knew exactly how the mechanism worked. Inside was a photograph he'd nearly forgotten existed. Himself and Isolde, years younger, standing in front of the old quarters fountain before the city had torn it down for development. Her smile was unguarded in that image. His arm around her shoulders carried protective certainty he'd later decided was weakness. He closed the locket carefully and let it fall back against Kale's chest. When he met the boy's eyes, he saw Isolde's features with new recognition. The shape of the jaw. The set of the mouth. The unusual eye color caught between gray and green. This wasn't just some random child from Isolde's present. This was living proof of a past Caspian had tried to bury beneath power and violence and deliberate emotional numbness. "How old are you?" Caspian asked, though he was already calculating timelines in his head with sickening precision. 10, Kale answered. "I'll be 11 in March." The mathematics aligned perfectly with the night Caspian had left. The night he'd chosen to answer his mentor's summons rather than stay with the woman who'd loved him despite understanding exactly what he was becoming. The night he'd convinced himself that love was liability and power was the only currency worth possessing. Caspian turned away from Kale before his expression could betray the recognition detonating through his carefully constructed emotional architecture. He'd spent 12 years building an empire. 12 years becoming untouchable. 12 years believing he'd successfully amputated every softer part of himself. And in the span of 30 minutes, a 10-year-old boy wearing his mother's locket had just proven that some parts of the past refuse to stay buried, no matter how much blood you poured over the grave. The rain had intensified to the kind of downpour that transformed streets into rivers and drove most pedestrians into doorways and subway stations. Caspian dismissed Silas's offer of the armored sedan with a gesture that invited no argument. He needed to see this. Needed to walk the same route Kale had traveled to reach him. Needed to understand exactly what his name had become in neighborhoods he'd stopped visiting once his motorcades required security details and advance reconnaissance. Cale led the way with the confidence of someone navigating familiar territory, though exhaustion made him stumble occasionally on uneven pavement. He'd pulled his hood up against the rain, but water still dripped from his chin and soaked through canvas shoes that squelched with every step. Caspian followed 3 paces behind, his charcoal suit darkening as rain saturated expensive wool. His hand rested inside his jacket, fingers near the pistol he'd carried for 15 years, though he doubted the weapon would be necessary. Nobody mugged people in these districts anymore. They simply paid tribute to avoid worse consequences. The old quarter had deteriorated significantly since Caspian's last visit on foot. That had been perhaps 8 years ago, maybe 9, before his empire had expanded beyond recognition and his time became too valuable to waste on street-level observation. Now he saw what neglect and systematic extraction had produced. Buildings wore their decay like visible wounds. Broken windows patched with cardboard and plastic sheeting. Graffiti tags covering graffiti tags and palimpsest layers documenting years of territorial disputes. Fire escapes rusted to the point of structural failure, creating death traps that would collapse under any significant weight. But the physical deterioration wasn't what made something cold settle in Caspian's chest. It was the shrines. Small altars appeared every few blocks, tucked into alcoves and doorways, assembled from whatever materials the desperate could gather. Candles burned in glass containers despite the rain. Photographs of family members surrounded by offerings of coins, food, cigarettes. And above each shrine, written in various hands with varying levels of literacy, were prayers for protection from thorns collectors. Cale paused at one such shrine, crossing himself with automatic Catholic ritual before continuing. Caspian stopped, studying the altar more carefully. Someone had arranged the offerings with genuine devotion. Fresh flowers in a cracked vase. A rosary wrapped around a photograph of a young woman holding an infant. A handwritten note on lined paper, edges curling from moisture. Please God, let them pass our door this week. Maria is still recovering. We can't pay again so soon. The realization that his name had become synonymous with divine punishment rather than territorial authority transformed something fundamental in Caspian's understanding of his empire. He believed himself a criminal, certainly, but one who operated within codes that separated organized crime from predatory chaos. Protection meant actual protection, not simply protection from your own enforcers. Territory under his control should have been safer than neutral ground, not more dangerous. These shrines suggested his name had become the thing people prayed for deliverance from, as if he were plague or natural disaster rather than human authority capable of choice and restraint. 3 blocks further, Cale turned down an alley Caspian remembered differently. This had once been a thriving corridor of small businesses. A tailor who'd altered Caspian's first expensive suit. A restaurant that served food from the old country. A bookstore that stayed open until midnight for neighborhood insomniacs. Now the spaces stood empty or converted to purposes that didn't advertise. Metal grates covered windows. Security cameras pointed at angles suggesting paranoia rather than legitimate protection. An elderly man sat in a doorway despite the rain, sheltered under insufficient overhang, smoking a cigarette down to the filter. He looked up as Cale passed, nodding recognition. When his eyes found Caspian, the expression that crossed his weathered face cycled rapidly through recognition, fear, and resignation. He crushed his cigarette against wet concrete and retreated deeper into the doorway, pulling his coat tighter as if fabric could shield him from whatever consequences Caspian's presence implied. Caspian wanted to tell him he wasn't here for collection. Wanted to explain this was investigation, not enforcement. But the words died unspoken because what explanation could he offer? The man's fear was entirely rational given what Caspian's name had apparently come to represent in these streets. They passed a bodega where yellow police tape still fluttered from a recent incident. Cale's pace quickened slightly, his shoulders tensing in remembered trauma. Caspian caught fragments of conversation from people standing under the store's awning, voices carrying through rain-soaked air. Thorne's people came for Rodriguez. Said he was behind on territory fees. Broke his arm in 3 places. Territory fees? He's been paying weekly since August. Doesn't matter. They said the rates went up. Nobody told Rodriguez. Now he's in County General, and his kids are staying with relatives. Caspian filed the information with cold precision. More evidence of unauthorized operations. More proof that Varick had been conducting systematic exploitation using Caspian's authority as weapon and shield. The rage building in his chest had moved beyond personal betrayal into something colder and more dangerous. This was institutional failure. His organization had metastasized into exactly the kind of predatory operation he'd sworn never to create. Cale stopped at a corner where a street vendor sold coffee and pastries from a modified pushcart despite the weather. The vendor, a woman perhaps 50 with gray streaking her dark hair, smiled at Cale with genuine warmth that transformed into guarded neutrality when she saw Caspian. She knew who he was. Everyone in these districts knew his face even if they'd never seen him in person. Photographs from newspaper articles and courthouse steps and carefully orchestrated public appearances made him as recognizable as any politician or celebrity. "Just passing through, Mrs. Santos," Cale said quietly, answering a question she hadn't asked aloud. The woman nodded, her eyes never leaving Caspian, her hand moving beneath the cart's counter to where she probably kept pepper spray or something more permanent. Caspian maintained careful distance, recognizing that his presence was transforming this child's walk home into something that would require explanation and possibly apology from Cale to neighbors who'd wonder why he'd brought the wolf to their door. 2 more blocks revealed similar patterns. People recognizing Cale, then recognizing Caspian, then retreating with expressions that ranged from fear to barely contained rage. A teenage boy who'd been playing basketball in the rain abandoned his game mid-shot. A mother pulled her daughter inside an apartment building with force that suggested genuine emergency. An old woman spat on the sidewalk as Caspian passed, the gesture containing more eloquent condemnation than any words. This was his empire. This was what his name had purchased. Not respect earned through honorable dealings, but compliance extracted through systematic terrorization. Not authority built on reliable protection, but submission manufactured through unpredictable violence. He'd become exactly what his mentor had warned him against in those early years, back when the old man still believed Caspian might develop into something better than another brutal enforcer with territorial ambitions. Cale finally stopped in front of an apartment building that had seen better decades. 6 stories of crumbling brick and failing infrastructure. Water stains marked the facade in patterns suggesting the roof leaked during every storm. Several windows on the upper floors showed lights, but the ground floor remained dark behind security gates that looked recently reinforced. Someone had spray-painted, "Paid in full," across the gates in letters 2 feet high, the paint still wet enough to drip in the rain. Desperation's graffiti, claiming compliance with demands that would never be satisfied because satisfaction would end the revenue stream. Cale turned to face Caspian with expression that combined exhaustion, wariness, and something that might have been accusation. "This is where we live. 4th floor, apartment 4J. My mom's probably still awake because I left without telling her where I was going. She's going to be really angry, and then she's going to cry, and then she's going to ask me what I did that was so stupid that I thought it was worth getting myself killed." The child's voice had gone flat with the kind of emotional exhaustion that followed sustained terror. He'd done the impossible tonight, walked into a crime lord's fortress to deliver accusations no adult would have dared speak. And now he faced returning to his mother with news that might constitute hope or might simply mean he'd attracted even more dangerous attention to their already precarious situation. Caspian looked up at the building's 4th floor, counting windows until he identified which one likely belonged to apartment 4J. Light glowed behind thin curtains. He could see movement inside, someone pacing with agitation that was visible even from street level. Isolde. waiting for her son to return from whatever desperate mission had sent him into the night during a storm. Probably terrified. Definitely furious. And completely unaware that the past she tried to leave behind was currently standing on her doorstep in a rain-soaked suit, confronting evidence that time and distance had solved nothing. "You should go up," Caspian said, his voice rough from cold and something more complicated than weather. "Tell your mother you're safe. Tell her the men won't be coming back. And tell her." He stopped, uncertain what message he could send that wouldn't make this situation more complicated than it already was. "Tell her Caspian Thorn guarantees her family's protection. Effective immediately. No payment required. No conditions attached." Cale studied him with the unnerving directness children employ before they learn to hide their thoughts behind diplomatic courtesy. "Are you going to kill them? The men who hurt her?" The question deserved honesty rather than comfortable evasion. "Yes." "Good," Cale said, the word carrying no inflection beyond simple statement of preference. Then he turned and entered the building, leaving wet footprints across tile flooring that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Caspian remained standing in the rain, looking up at the fourth-floor window, watching shadows move behind those thin curtains. Somewhere up there, Isolde Vane was about to have a conversation with her son that would either offer hope or confirm her worst fears about the life she'd tried to build away from the violence that had consumed the man she'd loved. And Caspian, the untouchable Mafia boss who'd spent 12 years building walls between himself and any emotion softer than calculated rage, discovered he cared desperately about which of those outcomes transpired. The past wasn't buried after all. It was living on the fourth floor of a crumbling building in the old quarter, struggling to survive in the shadow of the terror his name had become. He pulled out his phone and called Silas. "I need surveillance on this location. Permanent detail, rotating shifts, best people we have. Nobody approaches this building without my explicit authorization." "And Silas?" He paused, watching that fourth-floor window. "Start gathering information on Varick's operations. Every unauthorized collection. Every unreported revenue stream. Every violation of protocol. I want enough evidence to justify what I'm about to do to him in front of the entire organization." "Understood," Silas said, his voice carrying satisfaction that suggested he'd been waiting for this purge with professional anticipation. "How severe?" Caspian looked at the graffiti on the security gates. "Paid in full. A prayer written in spray paint by people who'd exhausted every other option. Severe enough that nobody ever mistakes our organization for random predators again. We're criminals, Silas. But we're not animals. And it's time I reminded everyone of the difference." He ended the call and walked back toward the street where his car would be waiting. Behind him, the old quarter continued its deterioration under rain that washed nothing clean. But the shrines with their prayers for protection from Thorn's collectors wouldn't be necessary much longer. Because Caspian Thorn had just been reminded what his name was supposed to represent. And anyone who'd corrupted that meaning was about to receive an education in consequences that wouldn't be survived or forgotten. Caspian sat in the armored sedan 3 blocks from Isolde's building, watching rain distort the city lights into abstract patterns across the windshield. Silas had taken position in the driver's seat without commentary, recognizing that his employer needed silence rather than strategy discussion. The fourth-floor window remained visible from this distance, a square of yellow warmth in the building's dark facade. Shadows moved behind those thin curtains. Mother and son having conversation that Caspian couldn't hear but could imagine with painful clarity. Memory pulled him backward 12 years without permission, dissolving the present into fragments of past that had never healed properly despite all the power he'd accumulated to seal the wound. The art studio occupied a converted warehouse in the old quarter, back when the district still held possibility rather than decay. Isolde stood at her easel wearing paint-stained overalls, her dark hair twisted into a knot held by a brush. She worked on a canvas depicting the city's skyline, but rendered with colors that didn't exist in reality. Purple shadows where gray should dominate. Golden light bleeding from windows that held only darkness. Beauty extracted from urban brutality through sheer force of vision. Caspian had arrived bleeding from a collection that had escalated beyond professional discourse. His knuckles were split, his shirt torn, and his left eye was swelling shut. He'd climbed the fire escape to avoid explaining his condition to the building's other residents, entering through the window Isolde kept unlocked specifically for these unannounced visits. She'd looked up from her canvas, assessed his damage with practiced evaluation, and pointed toward the bathroom without breaking her painting rhythm. First aid kit is under the sink. Try not to bleed on the canvas. This piece is for a gallery showing, and abstract expressionism works better when the red paint is intentional. He'd loved her for that response. No fear. No judgment. No demands for him to become something other than what he was. Just practical acceptance that his world contained violence, and her world contained art, and somehow those incompatible realities had found intersection in the space between them. The memory shifted, pulling Caspian forward through months of stolen time. Nights spent in her studio while she painted and he read from the books she kept stacked in precarious towers. Mornings when he'd arrive before dawn, exhausted from jobs he wouldn't describe, and she'd make coffee strong enough to strip paint while asking no questions. Afternoons in the park near the old fountain where they'd sit watching people who lived normal lives and discussing whether normal was achievable or even desirable for people like them. You're going to have to choose eventually, Isolde had said one afternoon, her head resting on his shoulder while autumn leaves fell around them like copper rain. Between what you're becoming and who you want to be. Those paths are diverging, Caspian. I can see it happening. I can manage both, he'd insisted with the arrogance of someone who believed willpower could reconcile fundamental incompatibilities. I'll build something better. Use the power to protect people instead of just extracting from them. It's possible to do this work without losing yourself. She'd lifted her head to look at him with expression that combined affection and sadness in equal measure. That's what they all say. Every enforcer who thinks he's different. Every soldier who believes he can control the violence instead of letting it control him. You're not special, Caspian. You're just convinced you are. He'd kissed her rather than continue the argument, and she'd let him, but the doubt had planted itself between them like seed waiting for proper conditions to germinate. Caspian's phone vibrated with incoming message from Silas. Preliminary report on Varric's operations. 3 unauthorized protection rackets. 2 trafficking operations. Millions in unreported revenue. The evidence was sufficient to justify execution under their organization's internal protocols. Caspian deleted the message and returned his attention to that 4th-floor window, where the shadows had stopped moving. Cale had probably been sent to bed. Isolde was likely standing at her window now, looking out at the rain-soaked streets, wondering if her son's desperate gambit had made their situation better or catastrophically worse. The night he left played in Caspian's memory with cinematic clarity. His mentor had summoned him to a meeting across the city. Opportunity was being offered. Territory. Resources. Authority that would elevate him from street-level enforcer to legitimate power within the organization's hierarchy. But the meeting required immediate departure. No delays. No detours. Choice presented as binary equation, power or love, but not both. He'd gone to Isolde's studio one last time. She was working on a new piece, something darker than her usual style. The canvas showed the city's skyline rendered in black and gray, all the gold and purple bled out, leaving only harsh reality. I have to leave, he'd said, the words inadequate for what he was actually communicating. There's an opportunity. If I take it, everything changes. My position. My resources. My ability to protect people. She'd set her brush down carefully, deliberately, buying time before responding. Will you come back? Yes. The lie had felt necessary at the time. Merciful even. He genuinely believed he meant it. When? When it's safe. When I've secured enough power that being with me doesn't make you a target. Isolde had walked to where he stood by the door, placing both hands on his chest over his heart. You're choosing this. I need you to understand that. Not being forced. Not trapped by circumstances. Choosing power over what we have here. It's temporary, he'd insisted. I'll build something better and come back for you. She'd reached up to remove the locket from her neck, the Art Nouveau piece he'd given her 3 months earlier for her birthday. Keep this safe for me. When you come back, you can return it. That way I'll know you actually intended to keep your promise. He'd taken the locket, fastened it around his own neck beneath his shirt, and kissed her with desperation that felt like drowning. Then he'd left through the window he'd entered countless times, climbing down the fire escape into the rain-soaked alley below. He'd looked back once. She was standing at the window, hand pressed against glass, watching him disappear into the life he'd chosen over loving her. 12 years later, Caspian sat in an armored sedan staring at a different window, understanding with brutal clarity that he'd never gone back. Never sent word. Never checked if she'd survived the choice he'd made. He'd told himself the separation was temporary, then strategic, then permanent. The locket had stayed in a safe deposit box, unworn and unexamined, while he'd built his empire and convinced himself that emotional amputation was strength rather than cowardice. Isolde had discovered she was pregnant 6 weeks after Caspian left. She'd gone to the locations where his organization operated, trying to get a message through the layers of security that surrounded him. But Caspian had already ascended beyond reach. His people had turned her away with professional courtesy that masked threats. Someone wanted to speak to the boss? Get in line. Someone claimed personal connection? Everyone claimed personal connection. Someone was pregnant and needed help? Not their problem. She'd tried 3 times. 3 separate attempts to reach the man who'd promised to return. 3 encounters with armed men who didn't know her name and didn't care about her situation. After the 3rd rejection, she'd stopped trying. Pride and survival instinct combined to tell her that chasing a man who'd made himself unreachable was worse than accepting abandonment and building whatever life remained possible. She'd sold most of her art supplies. Abandoned the studio she could no longer afford. Moved to cheaper housing in districts where Caspian's name was whispered with fear rather than recognition. She'd worked 3 jobs through her pregnancy, saved enough to give birth in a clinic that didn't ask many questions, and raised Cale alone with determination that refused to collapse despite exhaustion and poverty and the constant awareness that her son's father commanded an empire 3 miles away and had never once checked whether his promises had left consequences. Caspian's hand moved to his chest, fingers finding the shape of the locket beneath his shirt. He'd kept it after all. Worn it for 12 years like hair's shirt or talisman. Never examined what that said about his supposed emotional amputation. Never acknowledged that keeping Isolde's necklace suggested he'd been lying to himself about severing all connection to the life he'd abandoned. The 4th floor window went dark. Isolde had turned off the lights. She was probably lying awake in darkness, processing what Cale had told her, calculating what Caspian Thorne's attention might mean for their survival. 12 years ago, his attention had meant art studios and afternoons in the park and the possibility that love could coexist with violence. Now his attention meant something entirely different. Protection, certainly. But also complication and danger and the certainty that her carefully constructed life away from his world was about to collapse. We should move, Silas said quietly, first words he'd spoken in 30 minutes. If we maintain position much longer, it will attract attention you probably don't want. Caspian nodded, pulling his focus from that darkened window. Take me back to headquarters. I need to review Varick's files personally before I decide how public his execution needs to be. The sedan pulled away from the curb, tires hissing against wet pavement. Caspian looked back once, the same way he'd looked back 12 years ago when leaving Isolde's studio. The building remained dark and silent. No face appeared at the window to watch him leave. No hand pressed against glass. Just absence and darkness and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade no matter how much power you accumulated afterward. He'd promised to return. He'd promised to build something better. He'd promised that choosing power was temporary rather than permanent. 3 lies delivered with sufficient conviction that he'd almost believed them himself. Now, 12 years and 1 empire later, he was finally keeping those promises. Not because he'd always intended to, but because a 10-year-old boy wearing his mother's locket had delivered accusations that shattered the comfortable fiction Caspian had constructed around his abandonment. Some debts compounded with interest over time. And Caspian was about to discover exactly how expensive 12 years of broken promises had become. The building stood like a rotted tooth in the mouth of the Narrows, 5 stories of crumbling brick and broken promises. Caspian pressed himself into the doorway of an abandoned shop across the street, his breath misting in the cold air. The weight of his knife felt suddenly inadequate against his ribs. He didn't have to wait long. They arrived like wolves scenting blood, 3 of them, wearing Varric's colors. Red bands around their arms, that serpent sigil catching what little light the street lamps offered. Caspian recognized the type immediately because he'd been that type once. Young enough to feel invincible, old enough to have tasted violence and found they liked the flavor. The leader was tall and lean, all sharp angles and sharper eyes. He kicked open the building's entrance with practiced ease, and the others followed, their laughter echoing in the stairwell like breaking glass. Caspian's hands clenched. He knew this routine. He'd invented this routine. Through the grimy windows, he could track their progress upward. Floor by floor, door by door. He saw lights flicker on, saw shadows move frantically behind thin curtains. An old woman emerged onto a fire escape, pressing coins into the tall one's palm with shaking hands. A man with haunted eyes handed over a bottle of something that caught the light like liquid amber. Tribute. Protection money. Blood squeezed from stones. Then they reached the 4th floor, and Caspian's entire body went rigid. The door opened, and there she was. Isolde. Older than his memory, harder around the edges, but unmistakably her. She stood in the doorway like a fortress, one arm stretched behind her, clearly blocking someone from view. Even from across the street, even through the smudged glass, Caspian could read her body language. It screamed protection. The tall one said something. Isolde shook her head. The refusal was clear. One of the others, a stocky brute with a shaved head, shoved her. Not hard enough to knock her down, but hard enough to make his point. Isolde stumbled, caught herself, and then something happened that made Caspian's blood turn to ice water. A boy stepped into view. Small, thin, maybe 12 years old. He positioned himself in front of Isolde, his chin raised in defiance that was either breathtakingly brave or catastrophically stupid. Probably both. Kale. Caspian couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but he could read the scene like a book written in a language he'd learned too well. The boy's protectiveness. The men's amusement curdling into irritation. Isolde's desperate attempt to pull Kale back. The tall one's hand shooting out, grabbing the boy by the collar, lifting him half off his feet. Caspian was moving before he realized it, stepping from the doorway, his hand on his knife. But he froze mid-step as understanding crashed over him like cold water. This was his fault. Not directly, he'd never met these men, never given them orders. But the system, the fear, the casual cruelty that let them terrorize a building full of desperate people? He'd built that. He'd been the architect of this particular hell. These men were just living in the house Caspian had designed, collecting rents on terror he'd made profitable. The tall one released Kale with a shove that sent the boy sprawling. Isolde caught him, held him, her body curled around his like she could shield him from the whole poisonous world. The men laughed, that same laugh Caspian had heard from his own throat 100 times, and moved on to the next door. Caspian stood in the shadows across the street, watching the light in Isolde's window, understanding with perfect, terrible clarity that his son had been living in the shadow of his name for 12 years. Caspian entered headquarters through the service entrance, bypassing the lobby where his return might draw attention. The building hummed with its usual nocturnal energy, low voices behind closed doors, the click of keyboards, the distant ring of phones that only brought bad news at this hour. He moved through it like smoke, acknowledging no one, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the fury churning beneath. His office occupied the top floor, all glass and steel and carefully curated minimalism. He locked the door behind him and went straight to the safe hidden behind a panel in the wall. Inside were ledgers, flash drives, files kept separate from the digital network. Insurance, he'd always called it. Information that could destroy or save, depending on who wielded it. He spread the contents across his desk and began to read. The first discrepancy appeared in the accounts from Red Hook. Revenue down 40% over 6 months, officially attributed to market fluctuation. But Caspian knew those streets, knew the businesses, knew what they could bear. He cross-referenced with reports from his other captains, found similar patterns. Money flowing out of the official channels, disappearing into shadow accounts that his bookkeeper had flagged but never pursued. Varick's signature appeared everywhere, authorizing transfers, approving expenditures, justifying losses. Caspian pulled up surveillance logs next. Warehouse raids that hadn't been sanctioned. Meetings with distributors who weren't part of their network. A systematic expansion into territories Caspian had deliberately avoided, neighborhoods too volatile, operations too risky, the kind of desperate moves that drew federal attention. The scope of it was staggering. Varick hadn't just been skimming. He'd been building an empire within the empire, using Caspian's resources and reputation as scaffolding for his own ambitions. The numbers painted a clear picture, at least 8 million diverted over 18 months, possibly more if the gaps in the records meant what Caspian suspected. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. He found them in a separate file, buried 3 folders deep in an encrypted drive. A list of people, 47 in total, with addresses and surveillance photos and meticulous notes about their routines. Caspian recognized most of them immediately. Marco Tedeschi, who'd run a cafe where Caspian used to meet Isolde for coffee. Dead 6 months ago, officially a robbery gone wrong. Elena Vasquez, a social worker who'd helped Caspian's mother navigate the welfare system. Missing since last spring. Thomas Chin, a teacher at the community center where Caspian had learned to box. Found in the river with concrete blocks tied to his ankles. The pattern was unmistakable. Everyone on this list had known Caspian before the name, before the reputation, before he became the ghost of Red Hook. They'd known him when he was just Caspian Reeve, a kid trying to survive, trying to be decent in a world that punished decency. Varick was erasing his past. Systematically eliminating anyone who could testify to the fact that Caspian had once been human, once been soft, once been capable of love. It was strategic brilliance, really. You couldn't threaten a ghost with its past if there was no one left alive to remember it. Caspian's hands trembled as he reached the bottom of the list. Isolde's name was there. Flagged as, pending action. A note beside it, subject has leverage. Child confirmed. Recommend immediate resolution to prevent complications. The child. Cale. His son. Varick wasn't just targeting Isolde because she was a loose end from Caspian's past. He discovered Cale's existence and recognized the threat it posed. A son meant weakness, vulnerability, a pressure point that could be exploited. In Varick's world, in the world Caspian had helped create, such weaknesses had to be eliminated. Caspian closed the file with careful precision. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, a stranger's face wearing his features. Outside, the city glittered with 1,000 lights, indifferent to the violence being planned in its shadows. He finally understood what he'd built, and what it would cost to tear it down. Chapter 6. Caspian called the meeting for midnight, summoning every captain, lieutenant, and soldier with enough rank to matter. They gathered in the warehouse where he'd first consolidated his power 8 years ago, neutral ground, soaked in enough history that everyone understood the symbolism. The space echoed with murmured speculation as men filed in, their confusion palpable. Caspian never called full assemblies. He ruled through intermediaries, through distance, through the mystique of absence. Tonight, he stood in the center of the room under flickering industrial lights, fully visible. Varric arrived last, flanked by his own men, 6 of them wearing the casual confidence of bodyguards who'd never been tested. He moved through the crowd like a man walking into his own coronation, nodding to allies, accepting deference. When he saw Caspian waiting, his smile never wavered. "Boss," Varric said, spreading his hands in greeting. Quite the dramatic summons. "What's the occasion?" Caspian let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Around them, 50 men watched, waiting. He held up a flash drive between 2 fingers. $8 million, Caspian said. His voice carried in the cavernous space, quiet but absolute. Skimmed over 18 months. Unauthorized operations in 6 territories. A private army being built with my resources, under my nose, using my name as cover. The murmuring stopped. Varric's smile dimmed slightly, but held. "Careful, Caspian." The use of his first name was deliberate, a challenge. "You're making serious accusations." "I'm stating facts." Caspian tossed the drive to Marcus, his oldest lieutenant, standing at the edge of the circle. "The evidence is thorough. But that's not why we're here." He produced a piece of paper, unfolded it with deliberate care. The list of names. When he began reading them aloud, recognition rippled through the crowd. These weren't random victims. They were people from the neighborhood, elders, teachers, shop owners. People who'd existed before the ghost of Red Hook, who remembered when these streets belonged to the community, not the criminals. 47 people, Caspian continued. Dead or missing. All of them eliminated on your orders, Varric. All of them guilty of nothing except knowing me when I was young. Varric's composure cracked. They were liabilities. Witnesses to your past, leverage waiting to be used against us. I was protecting the organization. Protecting you. There's one more name on this list. Caspian's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. Isolde Rivera. Marked for immediate resolution. Along with her 9-year-old son. The warehouse went absolutely still. Varric read the shift in the room, saw his moment slipping away. He moved fast, hand diving for the gun at his waistband. But Caspian had been waiting for it, had known this was how it would end. His own weapon cleared leather in a heartbeat, the shot echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. Varric's men reached for their guns. They died before their fingers touched steel, cut down by Marcus and the others, the old guard, the ones who remembered what Caspian had built and why. It was over in seconds, bodies hitting concrete with wet finality. Caspian stood over Varric's corpse, watching the blood spread. When he looked up, 50 pairs of eyes stared back, waiting for explanation, for justification, for whatever came next. We are criminals, Caspian said into the silence. We break laws. We deal in vice. We profit from people's weaknesses. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't apologize for what we are. He paused, letting that truth settle. But we are not savages. We do not prey on children. We do not terrorize the defenseless. We do not kill teachers and grandmothers because they're inconvenient. He looked around the room, meeting eyes, daring anyone to challenge him. Anyone who crosses that line answers to me. Personally. Are we clear? The murmured assent rolled through the warehouse like distant thunder. Caspian holstered his gun and walked toward the exit, his footsteps loud in the sudden quiet. Behind him, men scrambled to deal with the bodies, to restore order, to understand what had just happened. The ghost of Red Hook had returned. And he was cleaning house. Caspian called the meeting for midnight, summoning every captain, lieutenant, and soldier with enough rank to matter. They gathered in the warehouse where he'd first consolidated his power 8 years ago, neutral ground, soaked in enough history that everyone understood the symbolism. The space echoed with murmured speculation as men filed in, their confusion palpable. Caspian never called full assemblies. He ruled through intermediaries, through distance, through the mystique of absence. Tonight, he stood in the center of the room under flickering industrial lights, fully visible. Varric arrived last, flanked by his own men, 6 of them wearing the casual confidence of bodyguards who'd never been tested. He moved through the crowd like a man walking into his own coronation, nodding to allies, accepting deference. When he saw Caspian waiting, his smile never wavered. "Boss," Varric said, spreading his hands in greeting. Quite the dramatic summons. "What's the occasion?" Caspian let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Around them, 50 men watched, waiting. He held up a flash drive between 2 fingers. $8 million, Caspian said. His voice carried in the cavernous space, quiet but absolute. Skimmed over 18 months. Unauthorized operations in 6 territories. A private army being built with my resources, under my nose, using my name as cover. The murmuring stopped. Varric's smile dimmed slightly, but held. Careful, Caspian. The use of his first name was deliberate, a challenge. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating facts. Caspian tossed the drive to Marcus, his oldest lieutenant, standing at the edge of the circle. The evidence is thorough. But that's not why we're here. He produced a piece of paper, unfolded it with deliberate care. The list of names. When he began reading them aloud, recognition rippled through the crowd. These weren't random victims. They were people from the neighborhood, elders, teachers, shop owners. People who'd existed before the ghost of Red Hook, who remembered when these streets belonged to the community, not the criminals. 47 people, Caspian continued. Dead or missing. All of them eliminated on your orders, Varric. All of them guilty of nothing except knowing me when I was young. Varric's composure cracked. They were liabilities. Witnesses to your past, leverage waiting to be used against us. I was protecting the organization. Protecting you. There's one more name on this list. Caspian's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. Isolde Rivera. Marked for immediate resolution. Along with her 9-year-old son. The warehouse went absolutely still. Varric read the shift in the room, saw his moment slipping away. He moved fast, hand diving for the gun at his waistband. But Caspian had been waiting for it, had known this was how it would end. His own weapon cleared leather in a heartbeat, the shot echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. Varric's men reached for their guns. They died before their fingers touched steel, cut down by Marcus and the others, the old guard, the ones who remembered what Caspian had built and why. It was over in seconds, bodies hitting concrete with wet finality. Caspian stood over Varric's corpse, watching the blood spread. When he looked up, 50 pairs of eyes stared back, waiting for explanation, for justification, for whatever came next. We are criminals, Caspian said into the silence. We break laws. We deal in vice. We profit from people's weaknesses. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't apologize for what we are. He paused, letting that truth settle. But we are not savages. We do not prey on children. We do not terrorize the defenseless. We do not kill teachers and grandmothers because they're inconvenient. He looked around the room, meeting eyes, daring anyone to challenge him. Anyone who crosses that line answers to me. Personally. Are we clear? The murmured assent rolled through the warehouse like distant thunder. Caspian holstered his gun and walked toward the exit, his footsteps loud in the sudden quiet. Behind him, men scrambled to deal with the bodies, to restore order, to understand what had just happened. The ghost of Red Hook had returned. And he was cleaning house. The building looked worse up close. Caspian took the stairs 2 at a time, Silas and 4 others trailing behind him. Their footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell, announcing their arrival like thunder. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, doors were already clicking shut, residents retreating behind whatever flimsy barriers they could manage. Caspian knocked on apartment 3C. 3 firm raps that held no menace, but carried weight nonetheless. He heard movement inside, whispered voices, then footsteps approaching. The door opened 6 inches, caught by a chain lock. Through the gap, he saw her, Isolde, older but unmistakable, with a kitchen knife gripped in her white-knuckled hand. "We already paid," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "You got everything we had. There's nothing left." Isolde. The single word stopped her cold. She looked at him, really looked, and he watched recognition dawn across her face like a sunrise. The knife clattered to the floor. "Get out." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Get out, get out, get out. I need to talk to you." "No." She tried to close the door but Silas had already moved forward, his palm flat against the wood. Not forcing, just preventing. Isolde's eyes went wide with fear, and Caspian felt something twist in his chest. "Please," he said. 5 minutes. Then we'll leave if you want." She stepped back, and they entered. The apartment was small, clean despite its poverty, decorated with a child's drawings taped to walls that needed paint. A boy sat at a tiny kitchen table, homework spread before him, watching with huge dark eyes that Caspian recognized from mirrors. Cale. His son. "You have no right to be here," Isolde said. She'd retrieved the knife, held it loosely at her side, not threatening, but not trusting either. 12 years, Caspian. 12 years without a word, and now you show up with your thugs. They're not here to hurt you. They're here to protect you. Protect me? Her laugh was bitter, broken. From who? From the men you trained? The organization you built? You think I don't know who's behind all of this? Your name is the one they use when they want us to be afraid. Varric is dead. The words fell into the small apartment like stones into still water. Isolde froze. The men who hurt you, Caspian continued, the ones collecting tributes, terrorizing this building, they were operating without my knowledge. I've dealt with it. Dealt with it, Isolde repeated, her voice hollow. You mean you killed them? Yes. She flinched. Behind her, Cale was watching, taking in every word with the kind of attention that meant he understood more than he should. I'm here to offer protection, Caspian said. A better apartment, security, money for whatever you need. No. Isolde's voice was steel. I am not going to be some crime lord's kept woman. I won't let my son grow up thinking that's how the world works, that you can buy your way out of abandonment, that money erases. Mom. They both turned. Cale had stood up, his small frame somehow commanding attention. He looked tired, older than 9, with shadows under his eyes that children shouldn't have. Can you make them stop hurting us? The boy's voice was quiet, direct, cutting through all the complicated history between his parents. Just that. Can you make them stop? Caspian knelt slowly, bringing himself to eye level with his son. Up close, the resemblance was undeniable, the same dark hair, the same sharp cheekbones, the same way of holding himself still when emotions ran too deep for movement. Yes, Caspian said. I can make them stop. Forever? The question held weight beyond its years. Kale wasn't asking for a temporary reprieve. He was asking if his father had the power to change the fundamental nature of their world, to create safety where none had existed before. Caspian thought of Varric's body cooling in the warehouse, of the message he'd sent to his organization, of the enemies this night's work had surely created. He thought of all the ways this could fail, all the threats he couldn't anticipate, all the violence that might still find its way to this door. But he looked at his son, this boy who'd grown up without him, who'd learned to be brave in the face of cruelty, who deserved a father who could promise protection and mean it, and made the only choice he could. Forever, Caspian said. Behind him, Silas shifted uncomfortably. Isolde's hand tightened on the knife. But Kale nodded once, accepting the vow with the solemn gravity of a child who'd learned that promises were rare and precious things. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building Caspian owned through shell corporations so Byzantine even the IRS had given up tracing them. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor. The kitchen had marble countertops that cost more than Isolde's annual salary. Kale's new bedroom was larger than their entire previous apartment. Isolde stood in the living room like a woman at a funeral, arms wrapped around herself, refusing to touch anything. There's a panic room, Silas explained, gesturing toward what looked like a bookshelf. Reinforced steel, independent air supply, satellite phone with direct line to Caspian. Security cameras cover every approach. I'll be in the guest suite, and there's a rotation of 4 men on the building at all times. A gilded cage, Isolde said quietly. A safe one, Caspian countered. She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes could have cut glass. For how long? A week? A month? What happens when your next rival decides my son is the perfect leverage? When someone else figures out what Varric figured out? That won't happen. You can't promise that. I can. I have. The argument was interrupted by Kale emerging from his new bedroom, looking small and lost amid the expensive furniture. He'd been quiet during the move, absorbing everything with that unnerving focus children developed when their world kept shifting beneath them. There's a TV in my room, he said. And a computer. And a bookshelf. You can fill it with whatever books you want, Caspian offered. Kale nodded but didn't smile. He walked to the window and pressed his palm against the glass, staring down at the city sprawling below. From this height, the streets where he'd grown up were invisible, reduced to abstraction. The days that followed established an uneasy rhythm. Caspian visited every evening, arriving after dark like some Gothic patriarch. He brought gifts, books for Kale, groceries for Isolde, things he thought might bridge the canyon of 12 years. Isolde accepted them with brittle politeness, maintaining a careful distance that hurt more than anger would have. But the outside world was noticing. In the organization, whispers circulated about Caspian's secret family. Marcus reported increased chatter from rival operations, probing questions, intelligence gathering, the preliminary movements of predators testing for weakness. 2 attempted breaches of the building's security were detected and neutralized within the first week. They're mapping you, Marcus warned during a late-night briefing. Looking for patterns, vulnerabilities. You've always been untouchable because you had nothing to lose. Now you have everything to lose. Caspian knew he was right. The crown he'd worn had been weightless when he cared for nothing. Now it sat heavy, threatening to drag him down. It was Kale who finally forced the reckoning. A week into their new life, the boy appeared in the living room while Caspian was reviewing security protocols with Silas. He stood at the edge of the conversation, patient, until both men noticed him. I have questions, Kale announced. Isolde emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, her expression warning Caspian to tread carefully. All right, Caspian said. Are you a bad man? The question was direct, surgical. Caspian saw Silas shift uncomfortably, saw Isolde's hand still on the towel. He met his son's eyes and chose honesty. Yes, he said. By most measures, I am. Cale absorbed this without flinching. Did you ever love my mom? Yes. This answer came easier, weighted with certainty. I did. I do. Isolde made a small sound, quickly suppressed. Cale's gaze flicked to her, then back to Caspian. Then why didn't you come find us? This was the question that mattered, the one that cut deepest. Caspian could have offered excuses. He'd thought they were safer without him. He'd been building something that required distance. He'd been protecting them from association with his world. All of it was true. None of it was enough. Because I was a coward, Caspian said finally. I told myself I was protecting you by staying away. But the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of being the father I never had. Afraid I'd infect you with everything ugly I'd become. Afraid that if you knew me, really knew me, you'd see a monster. The silence that followed was absolute. Cale studied him with those old eyes, weighing the answer against some internal measure only children possessed. Okay, Cale said eventually. But you're here now. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall between them. Caspian felt something shift in his chest, some locked door beginning to open. I'm here now, he agreed. Across the room, Isolde turned away, but not before Caspian saw the tears on her face. 6 months transformed the landscape of Red Hook more thoroughly than 6 years had. The purge following Varric's execution had been methodical, surgical. Caspian cut away the rot with the precision of a man who knew exactly where the disease had spread. 15 men were exiled from the organization, their territories redistributed. 3 more joined Varric in unmarked graves when they tried to resist. The rest received the new rules in writing, signed in their own blood if necessary: no targeting civilians, no preying on the vulnerable, no unauthorized violence. The ghost of Red Hook had returned, and he remembered what he'd once stood for. The underworld adapted. It always did. Profit margins tightened as the more predatory operations were shut down, but stability increased. The federal heat that had been building, inevitable when organizations grew too brutal, too visible, began to cool. Caspian's empire contracted slightly but grew more sustainable, more defensible. His enemies called it weakness. His accountants called it smart business. Marcus called it something else during their weekly meetings. You're building something that can last, he said one evening, reviewing the revised structure. Something your son won't have to dismantle or escape from. Caspian didn't respond, but the observation lodged in his chest like a splinter. The tentative rituals of family life proved harder to navigate than any criminal enterprise. Dinner every Thursday at the penthouse, a schedule that felt simultaneously too rigid and too fragile. Isolde cooked, refusing the private chef Caspian offered. She moved through the expensive kitchen with the same careful distance she maintained around everything in this new life, touching it but never quite claiming it. Cale had started at a private school, where the other children came from old money and new fortunes and couldn't quite place him in their established hierarchies. He'd come home last week with a black eye and a suspension for fighting. The other boy had called his father a gangster. Cale had broken his nose. I didn't know what else to do, Cale had explained, his voice small. He wasn't wrong. Caspian had held his son while Isolde iced the bruise. The 3 of them crowded in the bathroom like refugees from their own lives. No one had offered easy answers because there weren't any. Tonight's dinner was quiet. Pasta with marinara, garlic bread, a salad Cale picked at without enthusiasm. Silas ate in the kitchen, giving them the illusion of privacy while remaining close enough to respond to threats. Outside the windows, the city glittered with its usual indifference. There's a school play next month, Isolde said, breaking the silence. Cale has a part. One of the villagers in the 3rd act. I'd like to come, Caspian said carefully. If that's all right. Kale looked up from his pasta, surprised. Really? Really? You'll have to sit with the other parents, Isolde warned. Make small talk. Pretend to be normal. I can do that. Can you? The question carried weight beyond its words. She was asking about more than a school play, asking if he could truly inhabit this life, if the man who'd executed Varric in cold blood could sit in an auditorium and clap for third graders. Caspian reached across the table, slowly, giving her time to pull away. His fingers found hers, rough calluses against her worn soft hands. She stiffened but didn't withdraw. I don't know, he admitted. But I want to try. The honesty seemed to surprise her. She looked at their joined hands as if seeing them from a great distance, some future version of themselves that might actually work. Her fingers curled slightly, not quite holding his hand but not quite releasing it either. Kale watched them both, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, small, tentative, but genuine. The kind of smile that said maybe, just maybe, this strange new arrangement wasn't completely terrible. It wasn't forgiveness. Isolde still flinched sometimes when Caspian entered a room. Kale still had nightmares about the collectors who'd terrorized them. The enemies circling Caspian's empire hadn't forgotten about his new vulnerability. If anything, they were simply waiting for the right moment to strike. The life they were building existed in the narrow space between what was and what could be, fragile as new ice over deep water. But for now, in this moment, they sat together. Three people bound by blood and history and the tentative hope that broken things could be made whole again, even if the cracks always showed. Caspian Thorn had spent 12 years becoming untouchable, building walls so high nothing could reach him. Now, holding Isolde's hand while his son smiled across the table, he'd finally found something he couldn't bear to lose. And he would burn the world to protect it. Power can make a man untouchable. But love is what finally makes him answerable. This story wasn't about crime, it was about consequences. About the past we run from, and the people who force us to face it. If this story meant something to you, like the video, leave a comment and tell me what moment hit you the hardest, and share it with someone who appreciates stories with weight. Subscribe for more stories where power is tested, the past never stays buried, and redemption always has a cost. I'll see you in the next one.